So we're going to use what we just found out to graph this function without using Desmos. So the first thing that we want to do is find those x-intercepts. So remember, those x-intercepts come from these factors. So if x minus 4 is a factor, that means 4 is an x-intercept. So is 8, and so is 1. They're the opposite of the things that you find in those parentheses. So we know that this crosses at 1, 4, and 8, like that. So now we want to know what's happening there. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug in numbers, okay, into a table of values, but we don't actually care what they are. Let me show you what I mean. So we know that 1 crosses here, so I'm going to plug in something to the left of that. I'm going to plug in 0. Now, when I go plug in 0 up here, I don't even care what the number is. When I plug in 0, I get a negative number. When I plug in 0 here, I get a negative number. And when I plug in 0 here, I get a negative number. So a negative times a negative times a negative is a negative number. So I don't even care what I get when I plug in 0. I just know it's negative. So that means this part of the graph has to be negative. Now I'm going to plug in a number in between these two intercepts. So maybe I'll plug in 2. So when I plug in 2 here, I get a negative number. If I plug in 2, I get a negative number. If I plug in 2, I get a positive number. So a negative times a positive is going to be positive. So that means this part of the graph is positive. Now, I know it's going to have to turn around and come get that point. That's kind of a guarantee. So now that's the number, that's 4. So I need to pick something in between these two. So I'm going to pick maybe 5. When I plug in 5 here, I get a positive number. Plug in 5 here, I get a negative. Plug in 5, I get positive. So positive times a positive is a negative. So that means this part of the graph is negative. And at some point, we're going to have to turn around and come get that point. And the last thing I'm going to do is plug in a number that's to the right of that. So maybe 9. If I plug in 9 here, I get a positive. Plug in 9 here, I get a positive. And plug in 9 here, I get a positive. So that means when I plug in 9, I'm getting a positive number. Now, I want to point out some things that we talked about. If we FOILed this out, this would be a degree 3, okay? So that means at most it has 3 intercepts, which it does, 1, 2, 3. And at most it can have 2 minimums and maximums. And so it has a maximum and a minimum here, okay? So it cannot have more turning points. So that means that this graph here, it couldn't look like this and then go back up because that would be too many minimums and maximums, okay? At most we can have 2, and that's all we have here. All right, we're going to take a look at one more problem like this. Now the problem with this one is it's not factored. So when we have something with 4 terms, we can factor this by grouping. Hopefully you remember this from Algebra 1. So out of that first group, we can factor out an x squared, which leaves us with x plus 1. And then out of the second group, I can factor out a negative 4, which leaves us with x plus 1. Now, both of those terms have an x plus 1, so I'm going to factor out the x plus 1, and that leaves us with x squared minus 4. That's the other factor. And then we can finish factoring this, not the x plus 1. We're stuck with that. So x plus 1, but this is a difference of squares, so that's going to factor into a plus minus. So we take the square root of that, and we get x. Take the square root of that, and we get 2. So this function, when we get it all factored down, is x plus 1, x plus 2, x minus 2. So that means the x-intercepts are negative 1, negative 2, and 2. So we can put those on here. And now we want to know just what's happening in between those. So we're going to just plug in some numbers. I'm going to plug in something to the left of that, so maybe negative 3. Now I'm going to plug it in here, 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 and here. So when I plug in negative 3, that gives me a negative, and a negative. So that is going to be a negative value. Now I need to plug something in that's between negative 2 and negative no, sorry, -1 and -2. So we'll try -1.5. So when I plug that in, I get a negative, a positive, and a negative. So that means it has to be positive in between those. Then I'm going to plug in something like 0. That's going to give me a positive, and a negative. So that's negative here, and then we have to turn and get that point. And then I need to plug in something over there, maybe like 3, which will give me positive, positive, positive. Again, this was a degree 3. Remember, we started with a degree 3. So at most, it's going to have 3 intercepts, which it does. And at most, it's going to have 2 turning points, which it does.